"Sir, if the emergency extraction route crosses a restricted zone, why does the manual still say we're supposed to use it?" The room went silent so fast that even the air conditioner seemed louder. 120 recruits sat in the auditorium of Fort Adams Training Center, one of the most respected military training facilities in the country. Moments earlier, the atmosphere had been relaxed. Instructors were reviewing final briefing materials before the largest field evaluation of the year, an exercise that would determine which recruits graduated and which would be sent back for additional training. Then one recruit raised her hand. Her name was Emily Carter, 24 years old. Blonde hair pulled into a regulation bun. Average height. Average scores. The kind of recruit most instructors struggled to remember without looking at a roster. She wasn't the fastest runner. She wasn't the strongest candidate. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room. In fact, many people barely noticed her at all. But at that moment, every eye in the auditorium was fixed on her. Chief Instructor Ryan Walker stood near the projection screen at the front of the room. A former training commander with nearly 2 decades of experience, Walker had conducted hundreds of briefings just like this one. He was known for having an answer to everything. Yet when Emily asked her question, he didn't respond immediately. For the first time that morning, uncertainty crossed his face. Several recruits exchanged confused looks. Others assumed Emily had misunderstood something. A few even smirked. One recruit in the back row quietly shook his head as if she had just embarrassed herself in front of the entire class. Emily remained standing, calm, respectful, patient. She wasn't trying to challenge anyone. She wasn't trying to prove a point. She simply wanted an answer. Walker looked toward the large map displayed on the screen. Colored lines marked routes, checkpoints, observation zones, and emergency procedures. It was a familiar presentation, one he had delivered dozens of times. Yet something about Emily's question forced him to look at it differently. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. Then Walker cleared his throat. "We'll come back to that question," he finally said. His voice sounded controlled, but several instructors seated along the side wall exchanged brief glances. They had noticed it too. Something felt off. Emily nodded and sat down. The briefing continued. Slides changed. Procedures were reviewed. Questions were answered. But the energy in the room had shifted. Even the recruits who had laughed earlier found themselves looking back at the map whenever Walker advanced to the next slide. Because nobody could ignore what had just happened. One simple question had interrupted a process that everyone trusted. And for reasons nobody yet understood, the most experienced instructor on the base suddenly seemed distracted. What no one in that auditorium realized was that Emily Carter had unknowingly uncovered the first thread of a problem buried deep inside the training program. A problem hidden behind years of assumptions, routine procedures, and unquestioned confidence. Within days, that single question would trigger an investigation. Within weeks, senior officers would be reviewing records nobody had touched in years. And before it was over, people throughout the base would be forced to confront a truth they never expected to find. But at that moment, Emily was just another recruit sitting quietly in the middle row, unaware that her simple question had already changed everything. 48 hours earlier, nobody at Fort Adams Training Center would have guessed that Emily Carter would become the center of attention. She arrived before sunrise every morning, long before most recruits left their barracks. While others rushed through breakfast or tried to squeeze in a few extra minutes of sleep, Emily preferred quiet routines. She would sit near the edge of the dining hall with a notebook beside her tray, reviewing maps, procedures, and training manuals while the rest of the room slowly filled with conversation. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance. She wore the same uniform as everyone else. Her boots were always clean. Her bunk was always organized. Her performance scores placed her somewhere in the middle of the class. Not exceptional, not weak, simply consistent. That consistency was one reason many instructors overlooked her. Fort Adams rewarded recruits who stood out. The fastest runners earned recognition. The strongest performers attracted attention. The loudest personalities often became unofficial leaders among their peers. Emily was none of those things. She listened more than she spoke. She observed more than she reacted. During obstacle courses, she rarely finished first, but she almost never made mistakes. During classroom sessions, she asked very few questions. When she did speak, it was usually because she had noticed something others had missed. Most people interpreted her silence as shyness. The truth was different. Emily had always been curious about how systems worked. Growing up in Colorado, she spent hours helping her father repair equipment on their property. He often told her that machines usually warned people before they failed. The problem was that most people stopped paying attention once something seemed familiar. That lesson stayed with her long after she left home. At Fort Adams, familiarity was everywhere. Procedures were repeated until they became routine. Checklists were followed automatically. Maps were distributed, reviewed, and filed away. Recruits trusted the material because it came from experienced instructors. Instructors trusted it because it had been used for years. Few people felt any reason to question it. 2 days before the final briefing, Emily was assigned to a navigation review exercise. The task seemed simple. Recruits were required to compare field maps against digital route plans and identify key checkpoints. Most completed the assignment quickly and moved on. Emily took longer. As she studied the documents, something caught her attention. A marked extraction route appeared to pass near an area that recent training updates had designated as restricted. At first, she assumed she had misread the coordinates. She checked again. Then she checked a third time. The discrepancy remained. It was small enough that most people would probably ignore it. Yet the more she examined the documents, the more unusual it seemed. Emily quietly compared older training materials stored in the classroom reference cabinet. Several versions contained nearly identical markings. The route had remained unchanged for years. She frowned. That alone did not prove anything was wrong. There could be explanations she did not understand. Still, a question lingered in her mind. Why had nobody updated it? Later that afternoon, while other recruits relaxed outside the barracks, Emily sat alone reviewing the maps one final time. She was not trying to uncover a problem. She simply wanted clarity. The following morning, when the final briefing began, she carried that question with her into the auditorium. She had no idea that asking it would soon force an entire training program to examine itself for the first time in years. Fort Adams Training Center had built its reputation over 15 years. Photographs of graduating classes lined the walls of the administration building. Plaques recognized outstanding instructors. Framed commendations from military leaders reminded every recruit that they were training inside one of the most respected programs in the country. New arrivals heard the same message on their first day. The system worked because it had been tested. The procedures worked because they had been refined. The program produced results because generations of instructors had improved it over time. Few people questioned those claims. Most recruits were too busy trying to keep up with daily demands. Every day began before dawn. Physical training, classroom instruction, navigation exercises, team evaluations, equipment inspections. The schedule left little room for reflection. Success depended on trust. Trust the instructors. Trust the procedures. Trust the process. Chief Instructor Ryan Walker believed in that philosophy completely. During his 18 years at Fort Adams, he had watched hundreds of recruits arrive uncertain and leave prepared for military service. He knew every training module, every evaluation standard, and nearly every policy by memory. If someone had asked him whether the program contained any serious flaws, he would have answered without hesitation. No system was perfect, but Fort Adams came close. That confidence was shared by most of the staff. During weekly meetings, instructors discussed performance trends and minor adjustments, but major changes were rare. The foundation of the program remained largely untouched. It had become something more than a collection of procedures. It had become tradition. Meanwhile, recruits developed their own opinions. Some admired the structure. Others complained about the workload. Yet even those who criticized specific rules rarely challenged the overall system. It seemed too established to question. Emily Carter noticed that attitude almost immediately after arriving months earlier. Whenever someone asked why a procedure existed, the most common answer was simple. Because that is how it has always been done. The phrase appeared everywhere. In classrooms, during field exercises, in after-action reviews. Over time, Emily became curious about it. She understood the value of experience. She respected the instructors deeply, but she also believed that experience could sometimes create blind spots. People stopped examining familiar things because they assumed someone else had already done the thinking. 2 days before the final exercise, that belief returned to her mind when she reviewed the extraction route. The more she compared maps and documents, the more she noticed small inconsistencies. None of them seemed dramatic by themselves. A coordinate here, a notation there, a reference document that appeared older than the others. Tiny details, easy to dismiss. Yet together they formed a pattern she could not ignore. Emily considered bringing the issue to another recruit. Instead, she decided against it. She did not want rumors or speculation. She wanted facts. If she was wrong, the matter would end there. If she was right, the instructors would explain what she was missing. That seemed reasonable. By the morning of the final briefing, Emily had convinced herself the answer would probably be simple. Perhaps a recent update had not been distributed yet. Perhaps there was a technical explanation hidden somewhere in the manuals. She certainly did not expect her question to create tension inside a room filled with experienced instructors. But as she sat among 120 recruits listening to Walker explain the final field exercise, she noticed something familiar. The extraction route appeared again on the screen. The same route, the same markings, the same inconsistency. Emily stared at the map for several seconds. Around her, recruits copied notes and reviewed schedules. Nobody seemed concerned. Then she slowly raised her hand. Because sometimes the most trusted systems reveal their weaknesses in the smallest details. The auditorium remained quiet for a moment after Emily Carter raised her hand. Chief Instructor Ryan Walker acknowledged her with a brief nod, expecting an ordinary question. Most recruits asked about schedules, equipment requirements, or grading criteria. Nothing complicated, nothing unexpected. Emily stood when called upon, holding a printed copy of the route map she had been reviewing for the past 2 days. Her voice was calm and respectful. There was no challenge in her tone and no attempt to draw attention to herself. She simply pointed toward a marked section of the map projected on the screen. "Sir, if the emergency extraction route crosses a restricted zone, why does the manual still identify it as the primary evacuation corridor?" Several recruits looked up from their notebooks. Others barely reacted. At first, the question seemed minor. Walker glanced toward the map. "The route has been approved through established procedures," he answered. "You will not need to worry about those details during evaluation." A few recruits nodded and returned to their notes. The explanation appeared sufficient. But Emily remained standing. Not confrontational, just uncertain. "Yes, sir," she replied. "I understand. I was only asking because the latest navigation update appears to classify that area differently than the route documentation." This time, more heads turned. A recruit near the back quietly laughed. Another whispered something to his neighbor. The atmosphere shifted slightly. It was the kind of reaction that often followed when someone appeared to be overthinking a straightforward assignment. Walker folded his arms and looked toward the screen again. "Training materials are reviewed regularly," he said. "If there were an issue, it would have already been addressed." Emily nodded. "Understood, sir." Then she sat down. The exchange lasted less than a minute. Yet something about it lingered. Several recruits exchanged amused glances. One leaned toward another and quietly said, "She is trying to audit the entire program now." A few chuckled. Emily heard them, but showed no reaction. She opened her notebook and continued taking notes exactly as before. Across the room, however, one of the assistant instructors was staring at the map. He had participated in route planning reviews for years. Something about the coordinate Emily mentioned seemed familiar. Not alarming, just familiar. Walker continued the briefing with his usual confidence. Slide after slide appeared on the screen. Procedures, objectives, evaluation standards. Yet every few minutes his eyes drifted back toward the route diagram. By the end of the session, he had answered dozens of questions from recruits. None of them stayed in his mind. Only Emily's did. When the briefing finally concluded, recruits filed out of the auditorium discussing graduation requirements and field assignments. Some joked about Emily's question. Others had already forgotten it. Emily herself appeared unconcerned. She gathered her materials, thanked the instructor on her way out, and headed toward the barracks. To her, the matter was finished. She had asked for clarification and received an answer. But Chief Instructor Ryan Walker did not leave immediately. After the room emptied, he remained seated near the front row. The large map still glowed on the projection screen. For several seconds, he studied the extraction route in silence. Then he walked toward the control station and reopened a set of archived planning files. He told himself he was simply double-checking a detail. Nothing more. Yet as he entered the first coordinate into the system, a faint feeling of unease settled into the room. Because for the first time in years, someone had asked a question nobody else thought to ask. That evening, long after the recruits returned to their barracks, Chief Instructor Ryan Walker remained inside the administration building. The hallways were quiet now. Most office lights had been turned off, leaving only a few pools of light across the polished floors. Walker sat alone in front of a computer terminal, reviewing files that he had not examined in years. At first, he expected to prove that Emily Carter had simply misunderstood the documentation. The explanation had to be somewhere. Fort Adams did not earn its reputation by overlooking critical details. Yet the longer he searched, the more uncomfortable he became. The coordinate Emily mentioned appeared in multiple versions of the training manual. Older maps showed one classification. Newer updates showed another. Somehow, both had remained active within the system. Walker frowned and leaned closer to the screen. That should not have been possible. Every revision was supposed to trigger a review process. Every update was supposed to be verified before implementation. He opened another archived file. Then another. Minutes turned into an hour. The discrepancy remained. By 9 o'clock, Walker had stopped looking for reasons Emily was wrong. Instead, he started asking a different question. How had nobody noticed this before? He printed several documents and spread them across his desk. Different years, different instructors, different revisions. The pattern became increasingly difficult to ignore. At some point, an update had modified part of the navigation system while leaving other references unchanged. The conflict was subtle, almost invisible unless someone compared records from multiple sources. Most people never would. They trusted the latest version and moved on. Walker stood and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds. Outside, floodlights illuminated empty obstacle courses and silent pathways. Everything looked normal. Everything felt normal. Yet a recruit had noticed something experienced personnel had overlooked for years. The realization bothered him more than he wanted to admit. The next morning, before the first formation assembled, Walker arrived early and requested access to additional archives. An administrative specialist helped retrieve older digital records stored on backup servers. Some files dated back more than a decade. The deeper he dug, the stranger the situation became. The inconsistency was not isolated to one document. It appeared in several interconnected procedures. None of them created an immediate problem during routine exercises. That was likely why they survived unnoticed. But together they created a chain of assumptions built upon outdated information. Shortly before noon, Walker called two senior instructors into his office. He showed them the records without explaining where the concern originated. Both initially dismissed the issue as a clerical oversight. Then they reviewed the files themselves. The room gradually grew quiet. One instructor removed his glasses and looked at the documents again. The other requested access to the archive database. Neither laughed. Neither brushed the matter aside. For the first time, Walker saw the same expression on their faces that he had felt the previous night. Concern. Not panic. Not alarm. Just the uncomfortable recognition that something was not adding up. As the meeting ended, Walker gathered the files into a single folder. He looked at Emily Carter's name written on the attendance roster lying beside his desk. A recruit who rarely attracted attention had noticed what generations of reviews had missed. And if these records were telling the truth, the question she asked was only the beginning. 3 days later, the review had expanded far beyond Chief Instructor Ryan Walker's office. What began as a routine verification had evolved into something few people at Fort Adams expected. Additional records were pulled from storage. Training revisions were compared line by line. Administrative staff spent hours cross-checking databases that had not been thoroughly examined in years. The results surprised everyone involved. The issue was not a single incorrect coordinate. It was not one forgotten update or one misplaced document. Instead, investigators discovered a chain of interconnected references that had slowly drifted apart over time. Each revision had seemed harmless when viewed individually. One update adjusted a navigation classification. Another modified a procedural guideline. A third altered route planning standards. None of the changes appeared significant on their own. Yet together they created a hidden inconsistency that had quietly existed beneath the surface of the program for years. Walker sat through meeting after meeting reviewing the findings. The more he learned, the more unsettled he became. Fort Adams had always prided itself on attention to detail. Instructors taught recruits that small mistakes could become large problems if left unexamined. Yet the institution itself had fallen into the very trap it warned others about. Familiarity had created complacency. Procedures that once received careful scrutiny had gradually become accepted without question. Senior instructor Mark Reynolds summarized it during one review session. "Nobody ignored the problem," he said. "Nobody even knew it existed. Everyone assumed someone else had already checked." The room fell silent. Because everyone understood he was right. The training program remained effective. Recruits still learned valuable skills. Standards remained high. But hidden beneath that success was a weakness that nobody had recognized. Several officers reviewed records from previous years and reached the same conclusion. The inconsistency had survived countless audits simply because auditors focused on current documents rather than comparing changes across long periods of time. Emily Carter had done exactly what the system no longer did. She looked at multiple sources and asked whether they matched. Meanwhile, Emily knew nothing about the growing investigation. Her days continued as usual. She attended training sessions, completed assignments, and prepared for graduation evaluations. Occasionally, she noticed instructors speaking quietly among themselves, but she assumed they were discussing normal administrative matters. She never imagined her question remained at the center of those conversations. One afternoon, while reviewing another set of training materials, Walker paused when he saw Emily crossing the parade grounds outside his office window. She carried a notebook under one arm and walked toward the classroom building without drawing attention from anyone around her. Recruits passed her without noticing. Instructors barely glanced her way. She looked exactly the same as she always had. Yet because she chose to examine something everyone else accepted, an entire institution was now re-examining itself. Walker looked back at the growing stack of reports on his desk. The findings would soon be presented to base leadership. Recommendations would follow. Policies would change. Procedures would be updated. And somewhere inside those reports was an uncomfortable truth. The biggest problem was never the outdated information itself. The biggest problem was how long everyone assumed the information had to be correct simply because it had always been there. The findings reached base leadership on a Thursday morning. By noon, conference rooms across Fort Adams were occupied by instructors, administrators, and senior officers reviewing documents that few people had ever expected to see again. Years of revisions, updates, and archived records were spread across tables. What started as a simple verification had become a full examination of how the training program maintained its standards. Colonel James Whitaker, the officer responsible for overseeing training operations at the installation, listened carefully as Chief Instructor Ryan Walker presented the evidence. Nobody in the room appeared angry. Nobody searched for someone to blame. The records told a different story. This was not the result of negligence. It was the result of assumptions. Small assumptions repeated over many years until they became accepted facts. When Walker finished speaking, the room remained quiet for several seconds. Finally, Colonel Whitaker leaned back in his chair and looked around the table. "How many reviews passed without catching this?" he asked. An administrative officer checked the report. "At least 11 major audits, sir." The answer landed heavily. 11 reviews conducted by experienced professionals. 11 opportunities to notice what one recruit had noticed in less than a week. The colonel slowly nodded. "Then the problem is larger than the documents." Nobody disagreed. Over the next several days, teams were assigned to examine additional sections of the program. They were not searching for more mistakes. They were evaluating the review process itself. Questions that had never been asked before suddenly became important. Were instructors challenging old assumptions? Were updates being verified across all systems? Were people relying too heavily on previous reviews instead of conducting fresh evaluations? The answers were uncomfortable, not because the program was failing, but because success had made people confident enough to stop questioning certain things. Meanwhile, rumors began circulating among the recruits. Training schedules were adjusted. Several classroom sessions were temporarily postponed. Instructors attended unexpected meetings. Nobody explained why. Naturally, speculation spread throughout the barracks. Some recruits believed a major policy change was coming. Others thought new evaluation standards were being introduced. Emily Carter paid little attention to the rumors. She remained focused on graduation requirements and final assessments. One evening, while studying in the classroom, Another recruit named Tyler Brooks sat across from her. "Have you noticed everyone acting strange lately?" he asked. Emily looked up from her notebook. "A little." Tyler laughed. "Something is definitely going on." Emily shrugged. "I am sure they will tell us when they are ready." Then she returned to her work. Tyler shook his head and smiled. He had no idea that the person sitting across from him was connected to the mystery everyone was discussing. Neither did Emily. Across the base, however, her name appeared repeatedly in reports, meeting notes, and review summaries. Senior officers kept returning to the same observation. The issue had not been discovered through advanced software, special inspections, or expensive audits. It had been discovered because one recruit looked closely, compared information carefully, and asked a question. As the investigation expanded, a new realization emerged among the leadership team. The most important lesson was not about maps or procedures. It was about culture. If Fort Adams wanted to remain one of the best training programs in the country, it needed to encourage curiosity as much as discipline. Because sometimes progress begins when someone is willing to respectfully ask what everyone else assumes already has an answer. The official report was completed the following week. Its conclusions spread quickly through Fort Adams. Training manuals were revised. Archived procedures were corrected. Review protocols were updated to ensure future changes would be examined across every connected system rather than in isolation. What surprised people most was not the discovery itself. It was how the discovery happened. During a leadership meeting, Colonel James Whitaker summarized the findings in a single sentence. "The system worked exactly as it was designed to work," he said. "The problem was that nobody remembered to question whether the design still matched reality." That statement eventually appeared in training briefings throughout the installation. Instructors discussed it during staff meetings. Administrators referenced it while implementing reforms. The lesson was becoming larger than the original issue. It was transforming into a reminder that even strong institutions must continue learning. Recruits began noticing visible changes around the base. Updated route maps replaced older versions. Classroom materials were reprinted. Evaluation exercises were reviewed and reorganized. Nobody explained the entire story publicly, but everyone understood that something significant had occurred behind the scenes. Emily Carter remained focused on graduation. She completed her final assessments with the same steady approach she had shown since arriving at Fort Adams. She never sought recognition. She never asked whether her question had caused the recent changes. In fact, she assumed the instructors had probably discovered a simple administrative error and corrected it. One afternoon, as recruits prepared for their final field evaluation, Chief Instructor Ryan Walker watched them gather outside the training center. The class was laughing and talking as they organized equipment. Among them was Emily, standing quietly near the middle of the group reviewing her checklist. Walker found himself thinking about how differently events might have unfolded if she had decided to stay silent. Most people would have. Most people would have assumed the discrepancy was someone else's responsibility. Most people would have trusted that previous reviews had already verified everything. Emily had done something rare. She respected the system enough to question it. Later that day, Walker attended another leadership briefing. The final recommendations had been approved. Several officers discussed long-term improvements and future audits. Near the end of the meeting, Colonel Whitaker asked a simple question. Who originally identified the inconsistency? The room became quiet. Walker answered, "Recruit Emily Carter, sir." The colonel nodded slowly. "Make sure that fact is included in the final record." Walker looked down at the report in front of him. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one senior officer smiled and said, "Interesting. Hundreds of experienced personnel reviewed those materials over the years. A recruit found what they missed." There was no embarrassment in his voice, only admiration, because everyone in the room understood what that meant. Expertise mattered. Experience mattered. Training mattered. But none of those things replaced curiosity. Outside the conference room, Fort Adams continued operating as it always had. Recruits trained. Instructors taught. Schedules moved forward. Yet beneath that familiar routine, something important had changed. An institution known for teaching discipline had just relearned the value of asking questions. And the person responsible was still walking across the parade grounds carrying a notebook under her arm, completely unaware that her quiet attention to detail had already become part of the base's history. Graduation day arrived beneath a clear blue sky. Rows of chairs filled the parade field as families, instructors, and base personnel gathered to celebrate the newest class completing training at Fort Adams. The atmosphere felt different from the tension and uncertainty of the previous weeks. Uniforms were pressed. Flags moved gently in the morning breeze. Recruits stood in formation, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Emily Carter stood in the third row. Like always, she attracted little attention. She had completed every requirement, passed every evaluation, and earned her place among the graduating class. To most people in attendance, she was simply another recruit preparing to take the next step in her career. Chief Instructor Ryan Walker stood near the podium reviewing his notes. He had delivered graduation speeches many times before. Usually, the remarks followed a familiar pattern: discipline, commitment, service, responsibility. This year was different. When the ceremony began, Colonel James Whitaker addressed the audience first. He congratulated the graduates and praised the instructors who had guided them through months of demanding preparation. Then he invited Walker to deliver the final remarks. Walker stepped forward and looked across the formation. For a moment, he said nothing. The field became completely silent. Then he began speaking. He talked about excellence. He talked about standards. He talked about the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. The graduates listened carefully. Families watched proudly from the audience. Then Walker shifted his focus. Every class teaches us something, he said. This year, we learned an important lesson. We learned that experience matters. Training matters. Discipline matters. But none of those things matter as much as the willingness to think. Several instructors exchanged knowing glances. Walker continued. Recently, our training program underwent significant review and improvement. Those improvements began because one recruit noticed something others overlooked. A murmur moved quietly through the audience. Recruits glanced at one another, wondering who he meant. Emily looked just as curious as everyone else. Walker smiled slightly. The smartest person in the room is not always the loudest, not always the highest ranking, not always the most experienced. Sometimes it is simply the person willing to ask the right question. Then he looked directly toward the third row. Recruit Emily Carter, please step forward. For a second, Emily appeared genuinely surprised. Several recruits around her turned immediately in her direction. Tyler Brooks stared with wide eyes. Emily hesitated before walking toward the front of the formation. The entire field watched. Walker met her near the podium. Your attention to detail helped improve this institution, he said. You reminded all of us that learning never stops. Emily accepted the recognition quietly. No dramatic reaction. No speech. Just the same calm professionalism she had shown from the beginning. Yet as she returned to her place in formation, something had changed. The recruits who once overlooked her now watched with respect. The instructors who barely remembered her name now understood her impact. And throughout Fort Adams, her story would be remembered long after graduation ended. Not because she was the strongest recruit, not because she sought recognition, but because she proved that one thoughtful question could accomplish something years of assumptions never could. As the ceremony concluded and the graduates prepared to begin the next chapter of their careers, the lesson remained clear. Real respect is not earned by demanding attention. It is earned by paying attention when everyone else stops looking.